As I said, this is going to feature Navdev Sarna reads from his latest book stories along with the moderator on stage, Dr. Srijana Mitradas. Can we have a big round of applause for her? Just to read out a little about Dr. Srijana Mitradas, she read economics at the LSE before her PhD at Cambridge University, where she studied links between India's economic liberalization and identity politics. Srijana works at the Times of India's editorial page. She writes on politics, development, violence, gender, culture, and humor while managing a Q&A section. She also writes cinema reviews for the TOI and has co-curated its 175 years volume on entertainment titled Flashback. So, ladies and gentlemen, yet again, a big round of applause for Dr. Srijana Mitradas. And she would be in conversation with Mr. Navdev Sarna, and let me talk about him. He studied his commerce and law at Delhi University and joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1980. He is presently India's ambassador to Israel and has earlier served as a diplomat in Moscow, Warsaw, Thimphu, Geneva, Tehran and Washington DC, as well as most recently at Delhi as the Foreign Office spokesperson. His work includes The Exile, We Weren't Lovers Like That, the book of Nanak, Folktales of Poland. Ladies and gentlemen, with a big round of applause, let's welcome Mr. Navdev Sarna on stage. So this session is all about Dr. Srijana Mitradas in conversation with Mr. Navdev Sarna, and now it's over to you, Srijana.
Thank you, Aman, and thank you all. It's a great pleasure to be here and to speak with Mr. Sarna about his book and about all these fantastic stories. To be quite honest, I really started delving into the book quite recently, and I have to say the moment I picked it up, I knew I couldn't put it down until I'd finished it, because the stories have a tremendously magnetic quality actually about them. I would highly recommend them to anybody who's interested in stories about not only the partition but about human beings and what happens to human beings in times of great stress. So this is really a very extraordinary collection. I'd like to begin by first asking Mr. Sarna about the story of the story. You know, what led to this collection of stories? How did it come to be?
Thank you, Srijana, and I must thank this very loyal audience who's come to this session and not gone to the session called The Sexual Predator, which is very tough competition, frankly. But thank you all. And yes, if you're talking of the short stories here, this is a translation. So the original writer of these stories was my father, who was a Punjabi writer, Mohinder Singh Sarna. And he had a huge body of work, prose and poetry. But I picked 30 of his short stories which were focused on the partition of India, and translated them into English. And that is the story of this book. These are all short stories which have been earlier published in Punjabi in several collections and magazines and all that, and had been appreciated in Punjabi. But the problem with regional languages remains that you never have enough exposure. So the idea was that I should try and put it into the mainstream.
In fact, in the beginning of the book, there's a very interesting section that you've written where you describe how, you persuaded your father to let you translate these stories. And, he was a little shy at first about the process. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, he was not shy of the process, but he was in general a shy man. He was a very retiring, reticent person who was a government officer in his day job and a writer, but he did nothing else. Unlike us, he never went out to a party, or he would never go out to a literary event or a literary festivals, or he never thought of meeting publishers. He never signed a contract in his life. The publishers would come home and say, please give us this book, and he would say, okay, take it. And I don't know if he ever got anything called royalties. So when I said, this must do this must, he was indulgent about it, and he said, okay, do what you want. But, he didn't sort of really said, no, you must and all.
Actually, there's a very charming portion in your note, the author's note, where you say that actually he said, I have never considered having this translated and published in English because I don't have many contacts. So that...
Well, that was not relating to these stories, but in general. I mean, I remember an incident once when I mentioned the word contact, and it was like I had said some unpronounceable word in the drawing room. It's contact. It smelt of filth and sleaze and everything that is wrong. So that was just to depict the kind of writer he was. So there are writers and writers, and that's.
Well, I'm very glad that you pushed ahead with this. As I said, it's a very powerful collection of stories, and I would actually like to request you to read from the book. Perhaps we could begin with the title story, The Savage Harvest, and if you could just explain a little of the backdrop to the story and then read for us.
Yes, thank you. Since this is primarily a reading session, I suppose we must do the reading. Savage Harvest, which is the title of the story, was actually translated by me many years ago and was first published in the old Illustrated Weekly of India in English. In Punjabi, this story was very famous as, for those who understand Punjabi, the story was titled Chaviyan di Rut, which meant the season of axes, literally speaking. And it is the story of, based in the newly formed Pakistan, a story of an ironsmith who normally fashions sickles and harvest instruments, and then is being forced by his sons to make axes. So this is his story, because he's been asked to make axes because they need them for the riots. But I must say one word before I start reading about this story, about this entire book. And the hero in these stories are neither Sikhs, Hindus or Muslims. The hero in this story is humanity. So no matter which religion it belongs to, the hero that comes out of these stories is humanity. And that is the leitmotif of this book, that humanity survived in the worst kind of circumstances. Savage Harvest. As he bent over the furnace stuffed with hard coal, Dina's iron black body shone with the sheen of bronze. In fact, he seemed to be molded in bronze, resembling some statue of a healthy laborer. The muscles of his well-exercised torso rippled as he swung the hammer round his head, and a great blow fell on the red-hot bits of iron. The blows continued to fall and echo. Immersed in his work, Dina was lost to the world until the hot sun of late August, streaming in through the open window, began to lick at his very bones. With a start, he looked up. Already the sun was at its height and his work was not even half done. He shut the window to keep out the heat, but then found it difficult to breathe. A clammy sweat broke out on his forehead. It had rained furiously all night, as if the skies had opened up, and then continued to drizzle all morning. But now the sun shone brightly and a suffocating humidity had built up. He threw the window open again and bent over the furnace. The sweat was flowing down his ears onto his body in little rivulets. He wiped it off with his forehead and with his forearm. Thick drops fell on the fire. There was a little hiss, and for a split second, a piece of coal found some relief. He seemed to be on fire with the combined heat from the sun and the furnace. This fire had dissolved into his blood and was now roasting the marrow of his bones. The sharp, roaring flames made his eyes burn. Every hair on his body had become a wick, and it seemed to him that one of these wicks would catch fire any moment and blow up his body like a huge firecracker. Suddenly he dropped his tools and went to the window. The sky was lit up by the screaming sharp sunshine. His eyes could not adjust to the brightness and he winced. When he could see, he gazed at the fields that spread far before him, and at the sandy path that cut through them and went all the way to the horizon like a straight white line. On the right of the path stood the cotton crop, and the puddles of water in the fields occasionally flashed silver. On the left, the ploughed furrows awaited the seed. The scent of the earth, wet from the recent rain, made him nostalgic, and he wanted to jump out of the window. He wanted to roll in the fields and let the pores of his burning body soak in the moisture from the wet earth. He loved the fields. During the sowing and harvesting, his blood would tingle and a strange freedom would enliven his limbs. He was the village blacksmith, but there wasn't much work for him in the village, and he would spend a lot of time helping out the peasants in the fields. There wasn't a man in 7 villages that could match him during the harvest or lift a larger load than him. Suddenly his hands yearned for the feel of a sickle. Sickle's harvest. The sugarcane swaying gently in the moonlight. The call of the golden earth and the lilt in the songs born of this earth. He forgot for a moment that a hellish fire raged behind him, and that for the last 20 days he had done nothing but mold metal into axes and spears. The season of sickles and scrapes had passed. This was the time of axes and spears, and it had been a strange harvest. Instead of the wheat, those who had planted it had been chopped up. What kind of a mess had he forgotten himself into? It was as if he was shouldering the entire responsibility of arming the warriors of newly born Pakistan. Pakistan already existed, but to complete that reality, it seemed necessary to kill all the Hindus and the Sikhs. He did not understand this fully, but this was what everybody said, from the village heads to the imams of the mosques. And this jihad would succeed only if his furnace kept raging and spitting out fierce instruments of death. He turned again to the fire. The sharp bits of metal in the furnace were brighter than the coals. His head began to swim. A sharp, hot pain rose inside him and he gripped his side. Hunger. He hadn't taken even a drop of water since the morning. Now hunger was ravaging his insides and thirst had turned his lips to wood. "Oh, Bashir's mother," he shouted towards the house. "Give me water, quick." A woman of about 45 brought water in a jug. She wore a nose ring and her silver earrings swayed as she walked. She stared at her husband. He was panting with thirst. She had offered him food and water 3 times already since the morning, but he hadn't responded and had continued to blow at his fire. What had made him think of food and water now? She looked at the torrid fire, at the bits of iron scattered all over the floor, and at the evil pile of axes and spears. Then she stared at her husband's face for a long time, as if she didn't recognize him. Dina drained the jug at a go. "More," he panted. She brought more water and watched him as he drank. "That's all," he said. The taut veins of his body and forehead relaxed. His breathing eased. And then a shadow of discomfort crossed his face. "Why are you staring at me like that? Why don't you talk to me? And why do you stand away from me as if I have the plague?" She didn't reply. Instead, she went into the house and brought him food. "I'm talking to you," Dina shouted, shaking her by the shoulders. "Why don't you speak to me? Have you put rice to boil in your mouth that you can't speak?" The woman remained silent. Dina tore at a roti and tried to swallow a few large mouthfuls, but the food wouldn't go down his throat. He took a few bitter gulps of water and pushed away the basket of rotis. "Not talking to me, just staring as if I've been possessed by demons." "Allah forbid," she said, "but it does appear so to me." Dina's mouth fell open in surprise. He had lost all hope that Bashir's mother would ever speak, that she would break the stubborn silence of so many days. When he recovered somewhat from his surprise, he said, "I know what's on your mind, but what can I do? Your sons won't let me be. Now Bashir wants 50 axes ready by tomorrow night. He'll be at my neck if they aren't ready. I know you think otherwise, but if I don't obey them, they'll cut me into pieces." "Are they your sons or someone else's?" she asked, a little ashamed of her own question. "Mine," he replied, somewhat foolishly. "Then they should fear you, or should you fear them? You talk as if you don't know your own sons. What savages they are! Can I say anything to them, as if they wouldn't skin me alive? They are my sons too. His wife's tone was softer now. You know they shout and curse at me, but I don't go making axes for them. I only make axes, he replied. I don't kill people with them. It's worse than killing, she said. The killer kills 1 or 2 or at most a handful of people. Each axe made by your hands kills dozens. A tremor passed through Dina's spine. Then this trembling touched every pore of his body. For a long time he was silent, and then, "You're blaming me? Why don't you talk to your sons, the great warriors who burn 2 villages every night?" "Nobody listens to me." Her tone had grown even softer now. "How can I tell anyone what to do? Everyone will have to answer for their own sins. Why should I say anything to anyone?" For some time both of them stared at the floor, silently. Suddenly the woman said, "And why don't you eat your food? Do you want to starve?" She slid the basket in front of him. A soft knock on the front door shook Dina. He stood up in fright. It must be Bashir or his companions. They had come to threaten him. He hesitated with his hand on the latch and looked around. The fire in the furnace was raging. Everything was in place. He opened the door. Rusted with the season's rain, it screeched on its hinges. He jumped back several steps in fear, just missing the furnace. His wife's face drained of blood, and a scream escaped her lips. At the door stood the old wife of the Brahmin of the Thakurdwar.